is the whole evolutionary development of humankind, as well as the other species that humans developed from.
Peru is interestingly home to some of the most mysterious-looking skulls in archaeology. Responsible for raising lots of speculations within the scientific community, scientists have finally finished a new round of DNA testing on some of these skulls, and the findings revealed something nobody expected. These are the famous elongated skulls of Peru. The skulls are believed to be around 3,000 years old, and hundreds of them were uncovered in the desert sands of the Paracas Peninsula. Join us in this video to look through the recent stunning findings made by the scientific community about the Alien Peru skulls. Peru alien skulls. For years, mainstream archaeologists argued that the explanation was straightforward: head binding. According to this theory, infants had their heads tightly wrapped or placed between wooden boards from birth, slowly reshaping the skull as they grew. The idea became widely accepted. Museums displayed the skulls as examples of an ancient cultural practice, and most experts considered the mystery solved. But there was one major problem. The skulls themselves did not fully support that explanation. Some of these skulls are not just unusually shaped, they also show features that head binding alone cannot explain. Certain skulls appear to have much larger cranial capacities than those of normal humans, exceeding the average by hundreds of cubic centimeters. Others contain strange bone structures and anatomical differences rarely, if ever, seen in modern populations. Even the hair pigmentation found on some remains does not match what researchers would normally expect from ancient Peruvians. Then came the DNA tests. Early genetic analysis reportedly revealed mutations that scientists struggled to classify. One geneticist even claimed some of the sequences did not resemble known human, primate, or animal DNA currently recognized by science. The story quickly spread worldwide, but soon, mainstream scientists pushed back with their own explanations and criticisms. To understand why these skulls still spark debate today, we have to go back nearly a century to the year 1925. That year, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello was exploring the remote Paracas Peninsula along Peru's southern coast. The region was dry, barren, and seemingly lifeless. But Tello noticed something unusual: small mounds rising from the sand, ancient burial markers nearly erased by time. He began to excavate. What he uncovered would become one of the largest and most significant burial discoveries ever made in the Americas. By the time the excavations ended in 1928, Julio Tello had uncovered 429 mummy bundles. Each one was carefully wrapped in incredibly detailed textiles, some of the finest fabrics ever created by an ancient civilization. But it was what lay inside many of those bundles that truly shocked researchers. The skulls were unlike anything modern science had ever documented. Some were stretched far beyond normal human proportions. Others curved upwards into massive dome-like shapes, while some extended sharply backward. A few appeared nearly twice as tall as an ordinary human skull. Tello believed these remains belonged to a previously unknown people. He called them the Paracas, a pre-Inca civilization that lived between 800 BCE and 100 BCE, roughly 3,000 years ago. The Paracas were highly advanced in several ways. They were extraordinary textile makers, producing embroidered fabrics, still considered among the greatest achievements of the ancient world. They also practiced complex forms of surgery, including drilling into living skulls with remarkable precision, a procedure known today as trepanation. But perhaps their most striking characteristic was their widespread use of elongated skulls. Unlike isolated examples found in other cultures, this practice appeared across an entire population. Nearly every individual recovered from one major Paracas burial site showed signs of skull elongation. How did this happen? What did the recent DNA testing uncover about the true origins of these skulls? Keep watching to find out. Proof that Peru might have been home to an alien civilization. In a recent peer-reviewed study examining 159 skulls, researchers found that 98% had been intentionally modified. This was not a rare occurrence or random mutation. It was a defining feature of the culture itself. And this is where the mystery deepens. While historians agree that the Paracas practiced cranial modification, some researchers argue that certain features of the skulls go beyond what traditional head binding could produce. That debate continues to divide scientists today. Cranial deformation itself is well understood. The process typically involved placing wooden boards or tight bindings around an infant's head shortly after birth. Because a baby's skull bones are still soft and flexible, the shape gradually changes over time. This practice was not unique to the Paracas. Variations of it have appeared throughout history in many different societies, including the Maya civilization of Central America, the Huns of Asia, and even parts of rural France as recently as the early 20th century. But this is where the debate becomes far more complicated. Cranial binding can reshape the skull over time. What it cannot do, however, is increase the actual volume of the skull itself. And according to some researchers, several Paracas skulls appear to have a cranial capacity far larger than what is considered typical for humans from that era. Some specimens have reportedly measured as high as 1,600 cubic centimeters, while the average modern human skull is closer to 1,350. On its own, that difference might simply be dismissed as natural variation. But critics argue the anomalies do not end there. In normal human anatomy, the top of the skull contains a visible seam called the sagittal suture. This line separates the two parietal bones on either side of the skull. Yet in several Paracas skulls, that suture appears to be completely absent, making the skull look like a single solid plate of bone. Mainstream scientists point to a known medical condition called sagittal craniosynostosis, where the skull sutures fuse too early during development. But some researchers argue that within the Paracas remains, the feature appears too frequently to be treated as a rare disorder. Instead, they claim it shows up repeatedly across different individuals and burial sites, almost as though it were a normal, inherited trait. And the strange details continue. Certain skulls contain unusually large openings near the back of the head called parietal foramina. In modern humans, these openings exist, but they are usually tiny. In some Paracas skulls, however, they appear significantly enlarged. Other researchers have suggested that the position of the foramen magnum, the opening where the spine connects to the skull, may be slightly different from what is typically expected in human anatomy. Some skulls also seem to have unusually deep eye sockets and bone structures that appear denser or heavier than many other pre-Columbian remains. Then there is perhaps the most controversial detail of all, the hair. Several Paracas mummies were discovered with naturally red or blonde hair, something considered highly unusual in a region where indigenous populations have historically had dark hair for thousands of years. Researchers who studied the remains insist the color was not caused by sunlight, burial conditions, or chemical changes over time. According to them, the pigmentation appears natural, extending all the way to the roots. Some researchers even claimed that certain hair samples were noticeably thinner than the hair typically found in documented Native American populations. For years, details like these were mostly treated as strange curiosities, interesting but not important enough to challenge the accepted explanation. Mainstream archaeology had already reached its conclusion. The Paracas people were Native Americans, and the elongated skulls were simply the result of cranial binding. As far as most experts were concerned, the case was closed. Then, the DNA testing began. A researcher connected to a small museum on the Paracas Peninsula collected samples from 5 elongated skulls. Tiny bone fragments were carefully drilled from the back of each cranium and sent to a private genetics laboratory in the United States for analysis. The identity of the geneticist handling the tests was never publicly revealed. Months later, the reported results sparked international controversy. According to the claims, the mitochondrial DNA recovered from the samples did not match anything in the laboratory's existing database. The anonymous geneticist allegedly reported mutations unlike any previously identified in humans, primates, or other known animals. He reportedly suggested that the remains might belong to a biological line very distant from modern humans, including groups such as Neanderthals or Denisovans. How did the world receive this news? And what does this information mean for the scientific world? Let's see. The truth. The story exploded online almost immediately. News articles and documentaries across multiple countries repeated phrases like non-human DNA, turning the Paracas skulls into one of the internet's most debated archaeological mysteries. Mainstream scientists quickly pushed back. Critics pointed out that the skulls had spent decades on public display inside museums, exposed to curators, researchers, and tourists alike. Under those conditions, contamination was considered highly likely, perhaps unavoidable. There were other concerns as well. The anonymous geneticist never published the findings in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, and no formal paper was released for independent review. Without publicly available data or verification, many experts argued the claims could not be treated as credible scientific evidence. As a result, a second round of DNA testing was eventually organized. This time, samples were reportedly sent to 3 separate laboratories in an effort to obtain more reliable and independently verified results. One laboratory was located in Canada, while the other 2 were based in the United States. This time, researchers tried to reduce the risk of contamination. They used hair samples and bone powder, drilled from deep inside the foramen magnum, the opening at the base of the skull where the spine connects, an area believed to be less exposed to surface contact over the years. The reported results surprised many people following the case. 3 of the hair samples allegedly returned mitochondrial haplogroup H2A, a genetic marker most commonly associated with populations from Eastern Europe. Another sample, taken from one of the most dramatically elongated skulls, reportedly showed haplogroup T2B, a lineage historically linked to regions stretching from the British Isles to the Levant and the Fertile Crescent. 2 additional samples were said to contain haplogroups U2E and H1A, both commonly connected to populations near the Black Sea and Caspian regions. To supporters of the mystery, these findings seemed impossible to explain. If the remains truly dated back around 3,000 years, how could genetic markers associated with Europe or the Middle East appear in ancient burials on the Pacific coast of South America? There was no widely accepted evidence of transatlantic contact during that period, no known migration route, and no archaeological consensus that could easily account for such results. Mainstream geneticists argued that contamination remained the most likely explanation. Critics, however, claimed contamination was being used too quickly to dismiss evidence that did not fit existing historical models. The debate intensified until a major peer-reviewed study was later published in the scientific journal Cell Press. Many believed this study would finally settle the issue. The research team, led by Harvard geneticist David Reich, analyzed 89 ancient genomes collected from populations across the Andes, including individuals connected to the broader Paracas region. Their conclusions were clear. Every sample matched standard Native American haplogroups, primarily A, B, C, and D. Researchers found no confirmed evidence of European ancestry, Middle Eastern origins, or unknown genetic lineages. To mainstream science, the mystery appeared solved once again. But the controversy did not completely disappear. Critics of the study pointed out that the research did not specifically focus on the most extreme elongated skulls themselves. Instead, it examined individuals from the wider Paracas population and surrounding burial areas. And because of that distinction, some researchers argue that the central question still remains unresolved. A later forensic study was eventually carried out on tissue taken directly from an elongated, cone-shaped skull discovered near Palpa. This time, the findings were much more straightforward. The DNA was confirmed to be fully human. Researchers found no foreign genetic profiles, no alien sequences, and no evidence of anything outside normal human biology. So why did earlier independent tests reportedly produce European-associated haplogroups? Mainstream scientists still maintain that contamination is the most likely explanation. According to them, decades of handling, storage conditions, and exposure could easily have introduced outside genetic material into the samples. On the other side of the debate, fringe researchers continue to argue for the possibility of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, the idea that ancient peoples from Europe or the Middle East may somehow have reached South America long before recorded history says they did. Neither side has completely silenced the other. The original samples that reportedly produced the unusual DNA results were never independently retested under tightly controlled conditions. In addition, the laboratories involved never publicly revealed their identities, leaving many questions unresolved. As a result, the mystery remains open-ended. What scientists do agree on is this: the Paracas people absolutely existed. They intentionally modified their skulls, and they were part of the ancient Native American populations of the region. Those facts are no longer seriously disputed. Yet some puzzling details continue to fuel debate. The unusual cranial features, the reports of larger skull volume, the naturally light-colored hair found on certain mummies, and the controversial genetic results that still lack a universally accepted explanation. And then there is another discovery that has drawn renewed attention in recent years. Drone surveys across the Palpa region uncovered massive geoglyphs carved into the desert landscape. Some of these enormous figures appear to predate the famous Nazca lines by centuries, possibly even by as much as 1,000 years. A number of the figures seem to depict human-like forms with elongated heads. To some researchers, this suggests the Paracas may have been representing themselves, or perhaps figures important to their beliefs and traditions, across the desert on a monumental scale. The more archaeologists study the Paracas culture, the more remarkable it appears. Who are the Paracas? How influential was the culture in ancient Peru? Keep watching to find out. The Paracas culture. The Paracas culture was an ancient Andean society that lived between about 800 BCE and 100 BCE in what is now the Ica region of Peru. They were skilled in irrigation and water management, and they made outstanding contributions to textile art. Most of what we know about the Paracas people comes from excavations at a large coastal site on the Paracas Peninsula. This site was first formally studied in the 1920s by Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello. One of the most important discoveries is the Paracas Cavernas, a series of shaft tombs carved into the top of Cerro Colorado. Each tomb contained multiple burials. Evidence suggests that these tombs were reused over many generations while the culture was still active. In some cases, skulls were removed after burial, possibly for ritual purposes, and later reburied. The pottery found in these tombs includes finely decorated ceramics with carved designs, painted patterns, and other distinct Paracas styles. Alongside them were textiles made using highly advanced techniques, including complex weaving, plaiting, and knotting. These fabrics show an impressive level of skill and artistic development. Another major burial site, known as the necropolis of Huaricayan, contained hundreds of graves grouped closely together. These burials were placed inside and around abandoned structures on the northern slope of Cerro Colorado. The ceramics from Huaricayan are more refined and often include simple painted designs in red and white, as well as polished surfaces and other styles linked to the Topara tradition. Each burial consisted of a conical bundle wrapped in textiles. Most of the bodies were seated and faced north toward the Paracas Bay. They were buried with offerings such as pottery, food, baskets, and weapons. Before burial, each body was carefully bound with cords to hold it in a seated position, then wrapped in many layers of finely woven, richly decorated cloth. The textiles and embroidery from the Paracas necropolis are considered among the finest ever produced in pre-Columbian South America. In fact, they are the main reason the Paracas culture is so well known today. Burials at Huaricayan continued until around 250 CE. Some of the textiles found there show strong similarities to early Nazca designs, suggesting a cultural connection between the Paracas and the civilization that followed them. Many scholars, including Helene Silverman, believe that Nazca culture and its famous iconography developed out of earlier Paracas traditions. The Nazca people appear to have shared religious beliefs with the Paracas, and in their early stages, they continued several of their practices, including textile production, headhunting, and warfare. Researcher Hendrik van Gijsicum that Paracas remains in the Rio Grande de Nazca drainage, which later became the core region of Nazca civilization, are actually quite limited. In contrast, Paracas sites are far more common in areas such as the Ica, Pisco, and Chincha valleys, as well as along the Bahia de la Independencia. He also notes that the southern Nazca region, which later became the most densely populated part of Nazca society, was not an important center of Paracas settlement. Based on this, he suggests that Paracas groups likely entered the region later, and that their presence and population growth helped lay the foundation for what eventually became Nazca society. Over time, many Paracas sites were later occupied by a different cultural tradition known as Topara. For many years, scholars believed that the decline of Paracas culture was caused by an invasion of Topara groups from the north around 150 BCE. This idea was mainly based on the discovery of Topara-style pottery found at late Paracas and early Nazca sites. However, this invasion theory has recently been questioned. Evidence from sites such as Cerro del Gentil in the Chincha Valley shows that important ritual closures occurred before any sign of Topara occupation. These sites also show no clear evidence of conflict or resistance that would suggest a violent takeover. Radiocarbon dating further complicates the picture. The earliest confirmed Topara site Jiahui appears to have been occupied roughly 165 years after Cerro del Gentil was already abandoned. What do you think about the DNA analysis and the results? Do you think aliens might still have some part to play in the mutation? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you for joining us to look through the discovery, testing, and truths about the Peru alien skulls. We hope you found this video both interesting and thrilling. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the next video on your screen to explore more shocking discoveries. See you there.